Would you believe me if I told you that the most powerful empire in human history wasn't destroyed by barbarians at the gates? It wasn't destroyed by the Huns, the Goths, or even by a plague. The Roman Empire died because it committed suicide. It collapsed because a handful of men discovered what they thought was an infinite money glitch that would solve all their problems. They thought they could print their way to prosperity, distract the angry mobs with expensive sports, and tax the middle class until it simply ceased to exist. Does that sound familiar? It should, because the economic collapse of Rome isn't just ancient history. It is the exact, terrifying blueprint of what happens when a superpower forgets the value of its own money. In this video, we're going to expose the dark financial reality of Rome. We're going to look at the exact math behind the collapse, from the Great Debasement to the hyperinflation that saw prices rise by 15,000%. I'm going to show you how bread and circuses bankrupted the state, and how the Roman middle class was crushed so badly they actually welcomed the barbarians just to escape the taxman. By the end of this video, you won't just understand Roman history. You'll understand why financial gravity is the one force even an emperor cannot defy. To understand how Rome fell, we first have to understand how rich it actually was. Imagine you are walking through the Roman Forum in the year 150 AD during the Pax Romana. This was the peak of global commerce. And at the center of it all was a small silver coin called the Denarius. This coin was the reserve currency of the ancient world. It was trusted from the damp hills of Scotland to the deserts of Syria. If you had a denarius, you had value. It contained about 4.5 grams of pure silver. It was honest money, a day's wage for a day's work. But here is where the psychology of power starts to rot the economics of reality. Rome had a massive problem. It was simply too big. Running an empire that stretches from the Atlantic to the Euphrates is incredibly expensive. You have 300,000 soldiers to pay, thousands of miles of roads to fix, and a massive bureaucracy to feed. The bills were piling up fast. Enter Emperor Nero. You know him as the guy who supposedly played the fiddle while Rome burned. But his real crime wasn't musical, it was financial. In 64 AD, the Great Fire of Rome wiped out huge sections of the city. Nero needed to rebuild, and he needed to rebuild fast to save his popularity. He also wanted to build his massive Golden House, a palace so big it had a dedicated rotating dining room. But the treasury was empty. So Nero turned to his advisors and asked a question that has tempted every politician since the dawn of time. He asked why they were giving the people so much silver. Nero ordered the mint to reduce the silver content of the denarius from 98% to 93%. Now stop and think about that. Who notices 5%? If I handed you a coin that was 5% lighter or had 5% less silver mixed with a little copper, would you know? Probably not immediately. Nero realized that by shaving just a tiny bit of silver off every coin, he could create free money out of thin air. With the extra silver he saved, he minted more coins. Suddenly, he could pay the troops, rebuild the city, and throw games. It seemed like magic. It was the ancient version of quantitative easing. But he had just opened Pandora's box, because once an emperor realizes he can steal value from the currency, he never stops. For a while it worked. The economy boomed, or so it seemed. There was more money in circulation. But this created a cycle of addiction. Every time a new emperor came to power, he had to bribe the soldiers to keep them loyal. Where do you get the money? You clip the coin again. Even the good emperors did it. Trajan debased the currency to pay for his wars in Dacia. Marcus Aurelius did it to fight the Germanic tribes. But then, things got dark. By the time we get to Commodus in 180 AD, the dark reality of Rome's finances begins to merge with its obsession for entertainment. You see, when the economy starts to wobble, when people start noticing that prices are creeping up, you need a massive distraction to keep them quiet. We love to talk about the Colosseum, but as a financial historian, I don't see a monument to glory. I see a massive gaping hole in the budget. Let's talk about the economics of bread and circuses. This wasn't just fun and games. This was a state-sponsored welfare program designed to prevent riots. Rome was providing free grain to 200,000 citizens daily. On top of that, the games cost an astronomical amount of money. To put on a high-tier gladiatorial game involving exotic animals, like lions from Africa or bears from Scotland, cost millions of denarii. Emperors were spending money they didn't have to distract people from the fact that their money was becoming worthless. It was a vicious cycle. Then came Septimius Severus in 193 AD. He gave his sons one piece of advice on his deathbed, which is perhaps the most dangerous economic policy ever uttered. He told them to be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. That phrase, enrich the soldiers, became the death knell of the economy. Severus raised the military pay by 50%. A few years later, his son Caracalla raised it another 50%. Where did that money come from? They gutted the currency. By 215 AD, the denarius was only about 50% silver. But Caracalla went a step further in his greed. He introduced a new coin, the Antoninianus, which he claimed was worth 2 denarii. But in reality, it only had the silver content of 1.5. It was an official, state-sponsored scam. The government was saying this coin is worth $2, when everyone knew it was worth $1.50. This is where the psychology of the market kicked in. Gresham's law states that bad money drives out good. People aren't stupid. When they realized the new coins were junk, they hoarded the old, pure silver coins. They buried them in jars in their backyards to save them. The good money vanished from circulation, leaving only the trash money. And when you flood the market with trash money, you get one result: hyperinflation. Welcome to the crisis of the 3rd century. This is when the bottom fell out. In a span of 50 years, Rome had 26 different emperors. Most of them were murdered. Why? Because nobody could pay the bills. The currency collapsed completely. By 260 AD, the denarius, which was once 98% pure silver, was now just a copper coin dipped in a thin wash of silver. It was 0.02% silver. It was fiat currency, backed by nothing but the threat of a sword. The wash rubbed off in a week. Let's look at the data. The price of wheat in Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome, skyrocketed beyond belief. A measure of wheat that cost 7 drachmae in the 2nd century cost 120,000 drachmae by the end of the 3rd century. That is an inflation rate of 15,000%. Imagine walking into a store today to buy a loaf of bread for $2. You come back next week, and it's $10. The next month, it's $100. By the end of the year, you need a wheelbarrow of cash. That was the reality for the Roman citizen, and this destroyed the military. Remember the policy to enrich the soldiers? Well, suddenly, the soldiers' pay was worthless. They didn't want coins anymore. They demanded to be paid in actual goods. They wanted salt, leather, clothes, and food. The economy regressed. Rome went from a sophisticated market economy back to a primitive barter system. The complex banking networks collapsed. Long-distance trade became too risky. But the emperors didn't blame themselves. They didn't look at the debased coins and say, maybe we printed too much. No, they blamed the greedy merchants for raising prices. Enter Emperor Diocletian, a strong man and a general. He pulled the empire back from the brink of military collapse, but his economic fix was arguably worse than the disease. In 301 AD, Diocletian issued the famous edict on maximum prices. He decided that the problem wasn't the worthless money. The problem was that shopkeepers were charging too much. So he set a price ceiling. He kept the price on over 1,000 goods. 1 pint of beer was 4 denarii. A pair of boots was 120. He didn't just suggest these prices, he enforced them with the death penalty. The law stated anyone who charges above the limit will be beheaded. Anyone who hoards goods to wait for higher prices will also be beheaded. So what happened? Did prices come down? No. Basic economics kicked in. If you force a baker to sell bread for less than it costs him to bake it, he stops baking bread. The historian Lactantius wrote that much blood was shed for trifling causes, and people were afraid to expose anything for sale. Scarcity became much more general and grievous. The official markets vanished. A massive black market emerged where real prices were charged in secret. The dark reality was that the government had made it illegal to be profitable. But if you think price controls were bad, look at the taxes. As the currency became worthless, the state demanded taxes in kind. Crops, goods, labor. But they also needed gold for the army. Emperor Constantine introduced the solidus, a pure gold coin. This stabilized the economy, but only for the rich. If you were a senator or a general, you were paid in gold. You were fine. But the poor, the shopkeepers, and farmers used worthless copper. This created a 2-tier society. The 1% operated in gold and the 99% operated in trash. And the state became a predator. They introduced the system of the decurions. These were local town councilors responsible for collecting taxes. Here was the kicker. The imperial government set a tax quota for a city. They said to the decurion that you owe us 10,000 gold pieces. If the town couldn't pay, the decurion had to pay the difference out of his own pocket. Being a town councilor used to be an honor. Now it was a death sentence. Rich people stopped running for office. They fled the cities. They moved to their giant rural estates. This is a crucial moment in history. This is the birth of feudalism. The middle class was being taxed so heavily that they simply gave up. They abandoned their businesses and went to work on the estates of the super rich. They traded their freedom for protection. They became colony or serfs, bound to the land. Rome didn't fall because of a single battle. It fell because the citizens gave up. The Christian writer Salvian wrote that Romans were fleeing to the barbarians to seek humanity because they could not endure Roman inhumanity. Let that sink in. The taxes were so high and the bureaucracy so corrupt that Roman citizens packed their bags and moved to barbarian territory. When your citizens prefer the enemy to their own government, your civilization is already dead. By the time the Visigoths arrived, it was over. The sack of Rome in 410 AD was just the final blow to a shell. The economy had been hollowed out from the inside. The army was composed mostly of mercenaries because Roman citizens were too poor or too apathetic to serve. The infinite money glitch had failed. It wasn't one thing, it was the cascade. Debasement destroyed trust, inflation destroyed savings, price controls destroyed supply, and finally, taxation destroyed the middle class. Rome fell because the centralized state became a burden the economy could not support. The dark reality is that the Roman economy didn't collapse despite the government's best efforts. It collapsed because of them. They tried to cheat the laws of economics. They prioritized short-term stability over long-term financial health. And for a while, it worked. Until it didn't. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. When we look at the Roman collapse, we are looking at a mirror. The temptation to print money, to manipulate prices, and to distract the populace with spectacle is timeless. Rome offers us a warning. A society is only as strong as its money and its middle class. When you destroy those, no amount of legions can save you. So, the next time you hear about inflation or massive government spending bills, remember the Denarius. Remember that economic laws apply to everyone. Now, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the financial autopsy of Rome, you need to understand that Rome wasn't the only one to play these games. One of the most fascinating aspects of Roman finance wasn't just how they lost money, but how they gambled it away on sports.